It seemed like a done deal just a few weeks ago, but now it looks like the Iran nuclear talks have reached a dead end. The Biden administration isn't hiding its frustration, saying Iran is unwilling or unable to finalize the deal. The sticking point? Tehran demands a halt to an investigation into its purported nuclear activities at undeclared sites, something neither Washington nor its European partners are willing to accept. And as the talks stall, Israel says that the centrifuges keep spinning. Defense Minister Benny Gantz claims it would take just a few weeks for Iran to produce enough enriched uranium to make 3 nuclear warheads. All while Iran boasts of making stealth drones that could hit major cities in Israel. Are the US and Europe willing to jeopardize Israeli security for a chance to relieve some of their economic woes? Is a bad deal better than no deal at all?
So now, gentlemen, more than ever before, is a bad deal better than no deal at all? Let's begin our conversation with this quick fire round of 30 seconds each and dive into the debate in a short moment. Ori Barzel, please take the lead.
Thank you, Ellie. Thanks for having me. In my opinion, at the moment, no deal is better than a bad deal. We would have been satisfied with the original JCPOA compared to what we see now from Iran and their advancement. But at the moment, from what we know, the deal that was on the table had significant disadvantages for Israel. Hence, no deal, at least for Israel, is better at the moment than a bad deal.
Middle East analyst Nathaniel Shiraki, your take?
Well, clearly, two of the main arguments that are made by people who say that no deal is better than a deal and a bad deal is that that means that Iran is going to be able to fund further terror activities, but it's what they do anyway, whether they have money or not. That's the first funding that they do. The second thing is that people say they're going to be able to acquire the know-how and the capabilities to be a nuclear military power, but according to military intelligence, it's already the case. So a deal is better than no deal at all.
And Dr. Ori Goldberg, I've asked you this question numerous times in the past few months. Maybe you will be less of a broken record than I am and surprise me with your answer?
Oh, I doubt that will happen, Ellie. I have to say I don't approve of the framing of the question. It's not whether a bad deal is better than no deal. This isn't a bad deal. It's a good deal. There's a lot to be gained for Israel. There's a lot to be gained for the United States and Europe. There's certainly a lot to be gained for Iran. It's not just about economic woes. It's about the possibility of engaging the Iranians and discussing strategic issues that have to do with regional security as well as with Israel's security. This agreement, the original JCPOA, was good for Israel.
And this one as well. Okay, gentlemen, so please feel free, of course, to interact from this point onwards. But Nathaniel Shiraki, I do want to begin with you. Is it truly dimming optimism, or are we talking merely, final ditch negotiation tactic of sort, this arm wrestling at the very ending sprint?
Well, that's very clear that on the part of the Iranians, it's very probably something very classic. Everything is nearly signed, so you exert your maximum leverage because you have power and you can be heard to add some clauses to the deal. Now, what Blinken has been doing, and he hasn't done it directly, is that he's used the media to do that. It's not going to work. If you think that last-minute pressure strategy is going to work, it is not. Why? Because he made a very clear statement that it is going to set back significantly even the possibility of having a deal at all, sending the message to the Iranians that if you want to exploit last minute, that means you have no time. We have plenty of time. And it is true indeed for the Americans, probably not for the Israelis, but from an American point of view, the Iranians are choked economically and time favors America. So by talking to the media, saying that it's probably going to sabotage the whole deal, he's actually very subtly kind of counteracting the last-minute pressure strategy that Iran is exerting.
Yes, is Iran more under pressure than the U.S.? Midterms are coming. Some officials suggest that we are unlikely to see an accord being reached before midterms, but can President Biden really afford himself, after all the extensive, intensive efforts that he's invested, to reach midterms without an accord, Ori Barzel?
So that's a very good and delicate question, Ellie. I think that it leads us to exactly the point, in my opinion, that should be of the discussion, which is the broader context here. It's not simply the Iranian nuclear talks. I mean, we need to take into consideration, like you said, the American midterm elections coming up in November. We need to take into consideration everything that has to do with the war in Ukraine and energy crisis with oil and natural gas and so on, to some major EU countries. So we need to see the broader perspective here. And
Let me just toss into this boiling pot already. China and Taiwan, North Korea, all closely following the way the West is handling Iran in this respect.
Exactly. So I think whatever the West is going to signal now through the Iranian nuclear talks is going to affect other arenas and other potential negotiations in the very near future. So I would tend to agree with Nathaniel that the framing of a last-minute agreement is a bit problematic here. I do agree that compared to Iran, the Americans have a better upside in the negotiations, but still both sides have a lot to gain and to lose if they don't negotiate in a strategic way here.
And Dr. Ori Goldberg, perhaps as always, and I definitely point fingers at myself, we're looking at things from a too Western perspective. Maybe Iran's quote-unquote fresh demands from the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, to close its investigations, Tehran obviously dubbing them politically motivated. Maybe that was the goal all along.
I don't think that was the goal, and I don't think you have a perspective that's too Western. If anything, the tendency to look at Iran as a land of masterful negotiators who are always concerned with getting the upper hand kind of misses the point. The Iranians have a deep mistrust of the Americans. This isn't about ideology. This is about 2016, after the victory of Donald Trump. This is about Trump's unilateral withdrawal and imposition of sanctions. The Iranians wanted a clause in the new agreement that guarantees that a new American administration will not be able to pull a Trump. They were not provided with this.
Pull a Trump. I like that one.
Let me offer a suggestion here. The Iranians might be dallying because of this mistrust. The Iranians might actually want an agreement that comes after the midterm elections. The Iranians might be looking at the polls in the United States now and expecting President Biden to potentially emerge stronger and more capable of carrying out the mid and long necessary for the application and realization of this agreement. Other than that, there's also, of course, political infighting in Tehran. There are those who would like Iran to take a more militant, hostile stand with regard to the world, while there are those who still seem to be carrying the day in the hallways of power in Tehran, who feel that the Islamic Republic's future is wholly dependent on engagement with the world. I still think very much that this agreement will be signed, and that's because I think it is in the joint mutual interest of Iran and the United States to actually get this thing done.
And to that point exactly, Nathaniel, yes, at what point, if at any point at all, will Western powers say, you know what, enough is enough?
Well, they probably will never do that because it's not in their interest not to have any negotiating leverage over Iran. For a reason is that they have, as Dr. Uri was saying, it's connected to a lot of other negotiations that are happening in the world right now. If Iran gets emboldened by a nuclear deal, that will have a direct effect on Russia. Why? Because if the sanctions are lifted on Tehran, Russia might, which is an ally of Tehran obviously, might use Iran as a way to evade its own sanctions. Why I'm saying that is that way beyond the nuclear question. And it's just a stage for Western powers to signal a number of things. Even if a deal is never signed, having this kind of stage, as I was saying, to send certain messages to the non-Western world is very useful, and there's no reason that the E3, this group of European participants to the agreement, would relinquish that for no reason at all. I want to circle back to something that was just said. Yes, there is political infighting within Iran. There always was this level of very deep friction, but much less so than before, since the accession to power of President Raisi, who more than his predecessor is in line with the supreme leader. And given the composition of the current Iranian parliament right now, I was about to say, unlike the US can say that they are dealing with a rather cohesive partner of negotiation, which was not the case under Rouhani, not the case under Ahmadinejad, for instance, even if there was no negotiation. It's more the case under Raisi, which is probably a good point for those who want this deal to be signed.
And on the broader, perhaps on the flip side, more fundamental level, Ori Barzela, before we wrap up the first part of our debate, are we seeing a failure of internationalism or international mechanism to an extent? We cannot ignore the issue of the NPT, for example.
Exactly. In my opinion, going back to our point of the broader context here, I think that this is the ultimate test to the NPT regime, the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime, because Iran, compared to other regional actors, Iran is part to the NPT ever since it was signed by Iran in the late 60s, ratified in 1970. So Iran is part of the NPT regime, which the whole purpose of the NPT is to eliminate military nuclear capabilities.
Yeah.
So if Iran becomes a military nuclear power in the region, what would it mean when it comes to the broader context of the NPT? It might and potentially will lead to regional arms race in the Middle East. So we need to look at it from the broader perspective and see how we can eliminate the military plans, the military nuclear plans of Iran in order to affect the broader context and not lead to this kind of deterioration in the region and perhaps beyond.
Yeah, the other Ori, 10 seconds.
It's worth mentioning, Ellie, that Israel is not a signatory to the NPT, and it is a nuclear military power that's bringing about destabilization that Ori Barzela is describing.
And this is exactly where we will begin the second part of our debate right after the break. Not a member of the Accord, but definitely highly invested in it. Is it a failure to an extent, so to speak, of Israel when it comes to the nuclear negotiations with Iran? Taking a very short break, but Ori Barzela, Dr. Ori Goldberg, and Nathaniel Shiraki are staying with us, and so should you. But before we dive back into the conversation, let's take a quick listen to the most recent remarks by both Washington and Tehran's top diplomats.
Iran seems either unwilling or unable to do what is necessary to reach an agreement, and they continue to try to introduce extraneous issues to the negotiation that make an agreement less likely. But certainly what we've seen in the last week is a step backward away from the likelihood of any kind of near-term agreement.
The Islamic Republic of Iran has announced and is announcing its readiness to continue constructive cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. These parties to the Vienna process are expected to prioritize the interests of their people and their national interests and not be influenced by the non-constructive and destructive behavior of the Zionist regime.
So let's get to it. We stopped right there at the end of the previous block. Not a member or party, rather, of the Accord, but highly invested, that's for sure. Has Israel failed in the Iran nuclear negotiations. Dr. Ori Goldberg, 30 seconds, take the lead.
Thank you. Yes, Israel has failed in accomplishing its agenda of preventing nuclear capabilities and nuclear knowledge and know-how from Iran. It has also failed in its assumption that the nuclear negotiations will also include attempts to halt Iran's regional activity. Israel did not make its intentions clear. It specified only and exclusively what it did not want to happen. It did not have a positive plan. This is all backfiring as we speak.
Nathaniel Shiraki, your take?
Yes, I actually believe that the Israeli position is maximized. It's probably the best it can have. Why? Because they stated it loud and clear several times before going to Washington, after going to Washington. We are not a party to the deal. That means if you're an agnostic, you don't know what to think about this, it's the best of both worlds. On the one hand, there can be a deal with all its potential benefits, but if you don't believe there should be a deal, you have one party that is very militarily mighty, that's outside of the deal, and that can continue to hit Iran, including militarily and on its nuclear program.
So this lose-lose is a win-win for Israel, you're saying, and we'll continue to discuss that in a split second, but last and definitely not least, Ori Barzel, your thoughts?
Thank you. I think that we unfortunately failed back in 2015 and 16 because we were not part of the game, and mainly for political reasons, our attempt to shape the arena did not succeed. But nowadays, I do see a change in our strategy, and I think nowadays we operate in a better, much more structured way, and we have an input at the negotiating table.
Yeah, the question remains whether at this point in time, despite the confusion of the state of affairs when it comes to the negotiations, Jerusalem still has a say in this respect. And from this point onwards, please feel free to interact, of course, gentlemen. Let's say a deal is materializing and is taking place. Israel and the region as a whole will face a new old scenario to an extent, a reality in which Iran will be limited at least until 2030 on its path to a nuclear bomb. Is it really that bad, Ori Barzel?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think that going back to our original question of yes or no, I don't think it's black and white. I mean, I think it depends on what kind of a deal, the specifics of the deal, what type of implementation and monitoring processes and mechanisms we're going to see. I think that if the end result is going to be a nuclear Iran, again, the military capabilities, whenever, in 5 years, in 10 years, I think it would shift the region dramatically and would potentially lead to, again, like I said, to an arms race in the Middle East. I do think that all actors to the negotiations have something to gain and achieve without coming to this type of an end game with a military nuclear Iran. I think that Iran has a lot to achieve via negotiations. The West has a lot to achieve, and Israel as well, even though, like Nathaniel mentioned, we're not part to it, and we should gain from not being part to the agreement.
But speaking of the potential gains for Israel and the region altogether, if a deal indeed materializes, perhaps the response of this new emerging Middle East, Nathaniel Shiraki, would be to expand the Abraham Accords and establish this Middle Eastern NATO.
You mean including Iran?
No,
or
I'm saying that
Iran?
potentially as a response to this nuclear deal, I'm just theorizing here if we're trying to make limoncello from Jerusalem standpoint, maybe that would be the quote-unquote response to a nuclear deal taking place.
It's actually, I mean, you're totally right. It's actually in the cards. What I was about to say is that it's, at the very least, Israel gains times, you know, like at least 6 months before the great breakout point, if a good deal is, or relatively good deal is implemented, and at best 6 years of relative calm in the region to do what? To do exactly that, to cement its alliance with the Sunni monarchies, excluding Qatar, of course, and to do the Middle East air defense, which is already kind of in the cards, which is being led by Israel, and Israel obviously wants the buy-in of Saudi Arabia for that, which they might have, but they need time for this. So actually, the even if they don't believe in the deal, which is not certain, the Israeli military intelligence has been much more lenient toward the possibility of a deal than the Mossad. But even if they don't believe in it, they will have more time to prepare a defense system, this MEAD system.
And very quiet, Dr. Ori Goldberg. Yes, please.
I'm sorry to rain on your parades, but I would have to disagree, Eli, both with your assumption and with Mr. Shiraki's analysis. I don't think any such alliance is in the cards. I think we've heard about a potential Middle Eastern NATO against Iran, and we've heard about the moderate camp, and we've heard about preparations for a new Middle East and a new security doctrine. None of this has even remotely materialized, and that is not coincidental. It hasn't materialized because our partners in this potential alliance all seem to be quite adept at handling their issues with Iran on a very specific bilateral basis. This is true for the United Arab Emirates. It's certainly true for Qatar, whom Israel is now courting in a Palestinian context. It's true for just about every country in the Middle East, including, to a limited extent, Saudi Arabia. Israel cannot do this alone. Israel cannot fight Iran alone. Israel cannot mount its barrage of tactical assaults on Iranian assets in Syria or assassinations of Iranian scientists on Iranian soil forever. Certainly not if such an agreement is signed. And one last point, this whole notion of Israel buying time. If Iran possesses the knowledge it needs to create a nuclear weapon, there's absolutely nothing deterministic or known in advance about Iran's ability and willingness to use it. That, and I've made this point on this program before, is a political decision. Political decisions are based on context and incentives. Israel's insistence on doing exactly what it has been doing for the past 10, 15 years with regard to the agreement will, I am fairly certain, not bring Israel any good at the end.
Well, on that note, yes, Nathaniel, you have 10 seconds.
Yeah, just wanted to interject. I agree that obviously there's no NATO in preparation. That was just a metaphor that you were using. But like the
there's also
paradigm that any foreign policy actor just reacts to rational stimuli, not including ideology, not including religion, not including identity, not including human mistake. When it talks,
religion is included, and exactly for that reason, no MEAD is in sight. These arrangements between the United Arab Emirates and Iran, other countries in the region and Iran, have a much, much broader and more ancient history than Israel can imagine, exactly on the basis of religion, culture, and an understanding of coexistence.
A history of confrontation as well, a history of confrontation,
and
not a history
of global debates. You always do it, gentlemen. At the very end of the debate, you start interacting, and that annoys me, but we will talk about it next time. Dr. Ori Goldberg, Nathaniel Shiraki, and Mr. Ori Brazil, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.